Good afternoon, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The Wilson Center is delighted to collaborate this afternoon with the Toby Philanthropies of Northern California on this lecture. The Toby Philanthropies seek to promote the concepts and principles of a free democratic society, including open economic enterprise, self-reliance, academic freedom of inquiry, and limited government. This lecture is the fourth in the series the Toby Philanthropies and the Wilson Center have co-hosted. I'm Mike Van Dusen, Executive Vice President of the Center. The Woodrow Wilson Center serves as a national living memorial to our 28th president. In providing an essential link between the worlds of ideas and public policy, the Center addresses current and future challenges confronting our nation and the world. The Center promotes policy-relevant research and dialogue to increase understanding and be instrumental in enhancing the capabilities and knowledge of leaders, citizens, and institutions worldwide. Created by an act of Congress 42 years ago, the Center is a nonpartisan, non-advocacy institution supported by both public and private funds. In seeking to bring a wide spectrum of people together to discuss critical issues, we have a confident hope that from dialogue, participants can learn from each other. The work of all will be enriched, and better understanding and better policy can emerge. Through close to 800 events a year and the presence of over 150 scholars during the course of a year, the Center's work and its scholarship commemorate the ideals and concerns of Woodrow Wilson. This meeting today is very much in the Wilsonian tradition, bringing together practitioners and scholars for an informed exchange on what is clearly a critical issue in improving America's educational system. A few years ago, the Center was approached by the Toby Philanthropies, and we agreed to organize a discussion series in American values. The idea for the series comes from and reflects the deep commitments of the Foundation's president, Tad Toby. Mr. Toby was born in Poland and as a boy escaped from Europe on the eve of the Holocaust. With his family, he made his way to San Francisco. In gratitude for the opportunities for education and business that he found in his newly adopted country, Mr. Toby has devoted his philanthropic efforts to promoting the values he believes animate this country. The benevolence of its free institutions, the productive capacity of its private sector, and the fundamental decency of Western civilization and its millennia-old pursuit of truth, beauty, and justice. In different way, each of the speakers today addresses these values. Previous speakers in this series have included Donna Shalala, former Secretary of Health and Human Services and the President of the University of Miami, legal scholar Erwin Shermaninsky, the founding Dean of the University of Irvine Law School, California, and retired Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. For those of you who found out about today's event from our emails, you are in our database. For those who found out about it otherwise, please sign up outside to receive notice of future events in this and other series. It is my pleasure to turn the podium over to Dr. Sonia Michel, the Director of United States Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Sonia will introduce our distinguished speakers. Thanks again for being with us this afternoon. I look forward to a productive session.
Thank you, Mike. The Toby Discussion Series in American Values gives us an opportunity to bring to the center distinguished thinkers, scholars, authors, public servants, who can spark our own thinking, prompt us to step back and reflect on the ideas and principles that underlie our daily lives and our interactions. Today's lecturer and the respondent are just those kind of people. In their own lives and work, they have explored widely and thought deeply about American values, and we are fortunate indeed to have them with us to share their insights and understanding. Education has always been one of the most prominent of American values, and it is, of course, the central theme of Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot's work. Lawrence Lightfoot, the Emily Hargroves Fisher Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, has been studying, writing, and teaching about education for almost 4 decades. With a BA in psychology from Swarthmore College, she spent a year at the Bank Street College of Education in New York City, studying, among other things, community schools and parent participation, before going on to earn her PhD in the sociology of education at Harvard. She joined the Harvard faculty in 1972, and over the years, through her many courses and publications, she has developed a unique interdisciplinary approach to understanding education and how people learn and develop. She has won numerous honorary degrees and awards, including the prestigious MacArthur Fellowship, which she held from 1984 to 1989. She is the first African-American woman to hold a named chair at Harvard, and once she steps down, it will become the Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot Chair. To Professor Lawrence Lightfoot, education is not something that occurs solely in the classroom or another formal setting, nor is it something to be experienced only by the young. Rather, it is a holistic, lifelong process, perhaps closest to what the Germans call Bildung. In order to grasp the ways in which people become educated throughout the life course, Professor Lawrence Lightfoot has developed a method that she calls portraiture, which combines the insights of aesthetics with the understanding of broader patterns that comes from history and the social sciences. Explaining how she came to this approach in her 1994 book, I've Known Rivers, Professor Lawrence Lightfoot describes her reaction when, as a 17-year-old, she first encountered E. Franklin Fraser's famous study, Black Bourgeoisie. Fraser's two-dimensional descriptions of Black lives, she writes, masked the complexities of our lives and missed the nuances of our experiences. These flat portraits, she went on, did not capture the perspective of the people I knew, nor acknowledge our own insight into the losses embedded in our gains. We heard nothing about how the Black bourgeoisie actually negotiated and interpreted their daily lives. The encounter with Fraser left her feeling angry, frustrated, and affronted, but also energized and affirmed. And several decades later, this led her to write a book that told the stories of 6 African Americans of privilege in a way that she believed would capture more accurately the complexities and contradictions of their lives. Professor Lawrence Lightfoot's approach has revolutionized the way we now understand education. She brings to her projects a way of probing human development that she calls human archaeology, a process of digging down through biographical layers in order to grasp how both personal history and the history of a people and a society combine to foster individuals' creativity and wisdom. Among her 9 books, is Respect and Exploration, which, like I've Known Rivers, also brings together and tells the story of 6 different lives. But this one, because of its theme, is particularly relevant to the topic of today's lecture. The lecture picks up on another theme that threads through much of Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot's writings, namely the relationship among students, teachers, parents, and communities. This thread stretches from her 1978 book, Worlds Apart, Relationships Between Families and Schools, to The Essential Conversation, What Parents and Teachers Can Learn from Each Other, which came out in 2003. The theme also appears in one of her earliest articles, A Question of Perspective, Toward a More Complex View of Classrooms, published in 1978, in which she points out that children, purportedly our most precious resource, are often relegated to the margins, denied a meaningful role in the work of society, and ignored in both schools and families, their voices going unheard. Today, Professor Lawrence Lightfoot will pick up that thread again, explaining how listening to those voices, the essence of respect, can nourish goodness in education. Responding to the lecture will be James Forman, Jr., a professor of law at Georgetown Law School, and someone who also understands the value of education. Professor Forman comes to this issue by a different route. With a BA from Brown University and a JD from Yale, he clerked with Sandra Day O'Connor on the Supreme Court and then became a public defender in Washington. Seeking to understand why so many juveniles ended up in the criminal justice system, he zeroed in on the inadequacy of their schools and determined to do something about it. Forman was no stranger to activism. His father, James Forman Sr., was a prominent member of the civil rights and then the Black Power movements, and his grandmother, Jessica Mitford, was the daughter of a British aristocrat, was a radical who became a pioneering civil rights activist and critical journalist here in the U.S. In focusing on education, James Forman Jr. perhaps decided to take a more conventional route to change, but he did so in an unconventional way. Along with David Domenici, another son with a prominent father, Pete Domenici, the former Republican senator from New Mexico, Professor Foreman founded the Maya Angelou Charter School in Washington, D.C. in 1997, and when that became a resounding success, followed it up with 3 more charter schools, also in the district. These schools admit youths who have been in detention as well as dropouts, and the schools help them finish school and go on to higher education by providing rigorous education, job training, counseling, mental health services, life skills, and dormitory living. The recipe seems to work, and the schools here have become a model for dozens of others across the country. Foreman's zest for educational innovation, as well as his belief in the importance of respect, carry over to his law school teaching. In a course he teaches on juvenile justice, he brings his Georgetown students to meet teenage boys at a nearby juvenile detention facility, where he tells the young inmates, "I thought this would be a really good way for law schools to learn about juvenile justice. There is a certain amount you can learn from reading, but you also need to see and experience things. So I thought they would learn a lot from coming here and hearing about your experience." But, he goes on, the benefit for you, the juveniles in detention, is that they, the law students, know things about the law that you don't. You all have certain things you know, they have certain things they know. It can be a learning opportunity for everybody. Another word for this kind of mutuality, to use Professor Lawrence Lightfoot's phrasing, is respect. Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot.
Thank you. I got so involved in listening about me and then about my wonderful colleague and friend, James Foreman. What a wonderful framing of this conversation. Thank you so much. This afternoon, surrounded by the soaring spirit of Aretha Franklin, I would like to talk to you about respect. R-E-S-P-E-C-T. Find out what it means to me. Show me just a little respect. I believe that respect is the most powerful ingredient in creating authentic relationships, in nourishing good and productive school cultures, and in building healthy communities. It is a core American value embraced by all of us, animating our personal and professional relationships, deserving to be at the center of a rich discourse in this distinguished lecture series. For those of us who are educators, respect is a beautiful and crucial concept. We hear it in our rhetoric, we map it into our metaphors, we witness it in our relationships, we embroider it into our pedagogy, we build it into our curriculum, we try to be vigilant in practicing it, we recognize its pragmatic, philosophical, and spiritual dimensions. And respect extends from local neighborhoods to global communities. It is the core of a thriving democracy and a civilized world. Never has a dialogue about respect been more timely and more provocative than now, demanding our engagement, our commitment, and our full attention. Let's reflect on just the last decade. It has, in fact, been impossible to have any conversation that focuses on teaching and learning, that speaks about human rights, that refers to social justice without our minds being flooded by the bloody, horrific images, by the tragic, cataclysmic events of September 11, by the murders of innocent mothers and children in Afghanistan, by the brutal bombings and attacks in Israel and Palestine, and the volatile border conflicts between India and Pakistan, by the genocide and raping of women and girls in the Sudan, by the uncovering of child abuse and pedophilia by priests and bishops of the Catholic Church, by the terrifying and protracted war in Iraq, by the devastating flooding of the Gulf Coast and the obscenely inept response of the federal, state, and local governments who for years ignored all warnings of imminent danger, by the ugly nooses that hung from the trees outside a Louisiana high school, reverberating with the most horrifying symbols of slavery, by the violent Wall Street crash following the unleashed greed, deceit, and corruption by a whole host of corporate giants, underscoring the vast abyss between the privileged few at the top and the marginalized many at the bottom, by the home foreclosures, spiking unemployment, rising homelessness, and devastating losses of middle-income people who never expected to see life on the streets, by the rancor, rudeness, retaliation, and now death threats that have poisoned and distorted the recent healthcare debates, and on and on. The symbolism and reality of these assaults, taken individually or collectively, make us feel helpless, vulnerable, and victimized. Our tears express our deepest anguish, fears, confusion, and rage. Our democratic values and civil rights seem to be crumbling around us as we work to find our moral and spiritual anchors. In our adult confusions and impotence, we struggle with finding the right words to support and guide our young people. During these last several years of acute anxiety about our fragile and troubled world, we educators, our society's public adults, have felt a particular challenge and responsibility to take care of the children and young people in our charge, to help them come to terms with these awful, cruel events and their aftermath, to find a precarious balance between mourning and moving on, between revenge and reconciliation, and between grieving and getting busy. During these times of terror, I have, of course, felt my share of rage and anguish. I have had my share of horrifying nightmares. But on my best days, I know that I must find a way to work hard, intensely, wisely, generously, that I must cut through the trivia and distractions of everyday life and do things that have purpose and meaning, that will make an imprint, that will give forward to the next generation. More than ever, I have felt committed to, for example, enacting our democratic values. I have been devoted to supporting the coexistence of educational excellence and educational equality, joining diversity with high academic standards and outcomes for all. If we are to live in this world that grows smaller and smaller, we educators must recommit ourselves to building schools that are truly inclusive. We must develop rigorous standards and goals for all of our students and provide the supports that they will need in order to be successful in reaching them. We must develop relationships with our students that will inspire their trust, challenge their intellects, and that will have mutual respect at their center. Water. Hydration. It goes with respect.
Do you want a glass?
No. We have said these things for a long time with the best of intentions, but over the years, our rhetoric about justice and respect has begun to sound stale and over-rehearsed, much too facile. The shadows of darkness and violence that have preoccupied us recently compel us to recognize how very precious and fragile are our democratic principles, how very hard it is to sustain and nourish respect, and how complex the work of authentic inclusivity turns out to be. These themes of educational achievement and social justice have been central preoccupations in my life and my work. I've also worried a lot about how difficult those goals are to accomplish both institutionally and interpersonally, about the great distance between our expressed values and our daily habits. And I have worried about finding ways of addressing our chronic laments and our tired rhetoric. The opportunities and casualties of our dual quests for excellence and diversity, then, have been resounding notes in my siren song, particularly as I have explored in my research and writing the contours and dimensions of respect, as I have tried to shape a reconstructed view of this beautiful term. I remember feeling the power and majesty of respect and the deep connections between respect and justice at an unforgettable moment of grace. It was April of 1986 at the burial and requiem for my father, Charles Radford Lawrence II. My brother, Chuck, was giving the eulogy, his intimate and loving view of a very public man. Chuck's voice cracked as he recalled one of our father Charles's loveliest qualities, and now I'm quoting from my brother's eulogy. Our father Charles had a natural air of authority about him. He commanded respect without ever asking for it. In high school, my rowdiest friends, the guys who stole hubcaps and crashed parties, were perfect gentlemen in my father's presence. They'd stand and say, "Yes, sir, Dr. Lawrence," and answer his many questions about school and home and where their parents and grandparents were from. It was much later that I realized Dad's secret. He gained respect by giving it. He talked and listened to the fourth grade kid in Spring Valley who shined shoes the same way he talked and listened to a bishop or a college president. He was seriously interested in who you were and what you had to say. And although he had the intellectual and physical tools to outmuscle a smaller person or mind, he never bullied. He gained your allegiance by offering you his strength, not by threatening to overpower you, end quote. In my brother's words, I heard the recovery of rich meanings of respect. Through my tears that day, I heard the lovely symmetry and reciprocity, not the static hierarchy. I heard the tender transfer of authority, not the power plays. I heard the deep curiosity, the need to know, the urge to understand, not the arrogance of knowing it all or knowing enough. And I heard the beauty in the ordinary daily gestures, not the drama and glory of great public moments. I am sure that my brother's words of gratitude and loving farewell have burned their way into my heart, fueled my interest in respect, and shaped the way I understand and interpret its meanings. As a researcher and educator, I have also seen the power of respect in schools and classrooms, seen the way in which respect is crucial in nourishing and sustaining relationships between teachers and students. In the last 30 years, for example, I have visited literally hundreds of schools across this country and around the world, from city schools in poor communities to affluent suburban schools, from remote rural schools to elite preparatory academies. And in all of them, I have asked students to identify their good teachers and to tell me why they think they are good. The students' answers across all of these diverse settings are always the same. Why do we think Mrs. Green is a good teacher? They ask me incredulously, as if I should know the answer. Because, they say, she respects us. I push further, trying to discover what they mean. Again, there's no reluctance or ambivalence in their responses. They feel respected by teachers who make them feel visible and worthy, who are demanding, who hold high standards for them, who insist that they learn. And they feel disrespected or dissed by teachers who never bother to get to know them, who let them off easy, who do not take them seriously or believe that they can be successful. Respect grows in relationships of expectation, challenge, and rigor. It is diminished by inattention, indifference, and empty ritual. A Gathering of Gifts is a beautiful book by my sister, Paula Lawrence Waymiller. You see, I have brought my siblings with me this afternoon. Actually, I wish they were really here. A masterful, compassionate educator, an Episcopal priest, and a wonderfully poetic writer, Paula recalls the weeks of grueling anticipation before her first day of kindergarten and speaks about the primal fears that we all experience when we enter new communities. Her story rehearses the raw feelings of vulnerability and yearning for visibility and voice, the desire to be known. So now a quote from A Gathering of Gifts. It is 1951, and summer has come to a steady, hot, quiet hum in late August. A healthy amount of boredom in the air begins to let the summer end, making way for anticipation of my first day of kindergarten, the beginning of school. My brand new first day of school dress hangs on the mirror over my bureau, red plaid, I think, with a white collar. New cotton undies and a slip and soft white ankle socks are folded on the bureau. Very 1950s, right? And in an open shoebox with white tissue paper, unfolded enough to see them, are my new red school shoes. My mother had told the salesman something sturdy in a school shoe. I had been picturing bright red patent leather party shoes and was crestfallen when sturdy signaled the salesman to bring out brown with a tie. Mom and I must have persevered, each with our own image of what my first school shoes would be, because I ended up with ox blood, red leather with a double strap and double buckles. Pretty, but sturdy. Handsome was my father's peacemaking word for the compromised shoes. Every end of August night, before going to bed, I would carefully lift the shoes out of the crisp paper, smell the fresh new leather, put them on the floor next to my feet, and think, I am going to school. I'm going to step up the big high steps onto scary Mr. Gerke's scary big school bus, where I've heard that the big kids chant, kindergarten baby, stick your head in gravy, when the little kids get on. I'm going to a real school in a strange new place. Will anybody know who I am? The big question. Will anybody know who I am? For teachers and students across the developmental spectrum, from kindergarten through graduate training, the question is the same, and respect is a potent, omnipresent concept. It is on our tongues, embedded in our rhetoric. It is central to our value frameworks and institutional missions, and it shapes our daily actions and interactions. It is therefore both practical and prophetic. By now, I am sure you gather that my view of respect challenges traditional conceptions of the term. Let me briefly tell you what I mean by respect, identify what I think are its key dimensions, focus on a quality of respect that I find one of the most surprising and generative, and look at the work and wisdom of one practitioner of respect who embodies this quality. And because I am a teacher in my heart, I will close with 8 challenging lessons for those of us who want to bridge theory and practice, for those of us who want to join the practical and the prophetic, and for those of us who want to build families, communities, and school cultures animated by respect. So first, what do I mean by respect? Respect is commonly seen as deference to status and hierarchy. Usually respect is seen as involving some sort of debt due people because of their attained or inherent position, their age, gender, class, race, professional status, or accomplishments. Whether defined by the rules of law or the habits of culture, respect often implies required expressions of esteem, approbation, or submission. By contrast, I focus on the way that respect creates symmetry, empathy, and connection in all kinds of relationships, even those such as parent and child, teacher and student, doctor and patient, employer and employee, commonly seen as unequal. Rather than looking for respect as a given in certain relationships, I'm interested in watching it develop over time. I believe that respect generates respect. A modest loaf becomes many. With that in mind, I'm interested in how people work to challenge and dismantle hierarchies rather than how they reinforce and reify them, as well as with the ways in which the organizational context, the setting, shapes the ways in which people engage in respectful relationships. Since I focus on individuals, it is important to consider as well how family roots, temperament, and life stories shape the ways in which people are able to become respected and respectful. Rather than the language of inhibition and constraint, typical of a more old-fashioned view of respect, I listen always for the voices of challenge and exuberance. Rather than the language of dutiful compliance, I hear the words of desire and commitment. Rather than the broad and esoteric abstractions of philosophers or moral developmentalists so distant from the complexities of people's lives, I watch for the details of action and try to decipher the nuances of feeling and thought. In my book that begins with birth and ends with death, I identify 6 dimensions of respect, not to be heard as discrete ingredients of a prescribed recipe, but rather as a framework for considering the rich experiential complexity of the term. So each of these dimensions reveals a different angle of vision on the concept. So let me briefly tell you what these dimensions are. The first dimension that I explore and examined is empowerment. When we are respectful of others, We want to offer them the knowledge, skills, and resources that they will need that will allow them to make their own decisions and take control of their lives. Empowerment. The second dimension is healing, often not talked enough about in discourses about education. Healing. In showing respect for another, we hope through our work and our actions to nourish a feeling of worthiness, wholeness, and well-being in them. The third dimension is dialogue. In showing respect for another, we encourage authentic communication. We listen carefully. We respond supportively. We are willing to move through misunderstandings, distortions, conflict, and anger towards reasoning and reconciliation. The fourth dimension, and the one on which I will focus my remarks this afternoon, is curiosity. Curiosity. When we are respectful of others, we are genuinely interested in them. We want to know who they are and what they are thinking, feeling, and fearing. We want to know their stories and their dreams. The fifth dimension of respect is, of course, self-respect. In order to show respect to another, we must feel good about ourselves. Self-respect must not be confused, however, with narcissism or entitlement. It results from a growing self-confidence that does not seek external validation or public affirmation. It is learning to live by our own internal compass, one defined by a daily and a private vigilance. And the final dimension of respect that I explore is attention. Attention. When we are respectful of another, we offer our full, undiluted attention. We are fully present. We're completely in the room, sometimes engaged in vigorous conversation, sometimes bearing silent witness. So I want to talk to you about curiosity and its messenger, a man named Daoud Bey, because I think it is perhaps the quality of respect that surprises and enhances our view more than any other. Curiosity, it seems so innocent, so ordinary, so doable, and it seems to be the least tainted by political hype or tired rhetoric. It also seems so fundamental to relationships of all kinds, relationships between lovers, between parents and children, between teachers and students, between mentors and mentees, among colleagues, all kept alive by genuine curiosity, by wanting to know and be known, by the search for knowledge, by discovery, openness and attention to newness and change, by making oneself vulnerable to hearing things painful or incoherent. And curiosity is fundamental to the quest for justice and the commitment to inclusivity. Individually and institutionally, we must be genuinely interested in the stranger's voice and in the challenges and opportunities that his or her perspectives will bring. As an artist and photographer whose work hangs all over the world in prominent museums, Daoud Bey creates larger than life-size color portraits that allow us to see into the psyche of his subjects. His powerful images hang in art museums across this country and around the world. When Daoud talks about his art, he points to the development of relationships with his subjects at the center of his work. If most of us think of photographers with a camera held up in front of their faces, using their equipment as mask or barrier, hiding out while they expose others, then Daoud Bey stands in defiant contrast. He believes that photographers must enter into relationships with their subjects that are mutual and symmetric, where both photographer and subject are unmasked, making way for trust and dialogue. Daoud's photography is more about discovery, more about finding out what is true for each person through listening to his or her stories, than it is about presenting a likable portrayal. For him, photography begins always with a deep curiosity. I'm endlessly curious, he says about the primary motivation that defines his respectful regard of the people with whom he works. In his early 20s, Daoud began his career hanging out in the streets of central Harlem, streets that were both exotic and familiar to this middle-class black boy from Queens. For 5 years, from 1975 to 1980, he worked to develop his unique approach to making pictures about the human experience. His hanging out, however, was methodical. He would select a particular area, usually a 10-block square, like from 125th Street to 135th Street, moving from east to west, and he would land there each day with his 35-millimeter camera hanging around his neck. For several days, he wouldn't take any pictures, just stand around, approach people, and begin a conversation. Sometimes he'd go to the same bus stop for several days in a row and begin to recognize the people who would arrive at the same time each day. They would begin to notice him, and eventually they'd strike up a conversation. This was very hard for me, admits Dayoud. I was an incredibly shy person by temperament. As a child, I was a stutterer, very reticent and fearful about reaching out. I think making pictures was the way I began to engage people, the way I came out of my shyness. But even as a novice, Dayoud knew that photographs grew out of relationships and that the process had to be reciprocal. This reciprocity usually emerged out of the sharing of stories. Courageously pushing past his reticence, Dayoud forced himself to reach out to folks and make a connection. Sometimes he had to begin the storytelling in order for people to feel moved to carry on. But once the ball got rolling, he found that one story encouraged others. Before you knew it, afternoon had slipped into evening, and an atmosphere of reciprocity had emerged. The stories were usually inspired by a question, by genuine curiosity about the other person. The curiosity could not be faked. Despite the shyness, his shyness, Dayoud thinks that part of the reason that he was able to learn how to reach out to people was because his father was an amazingly friendly and gregarious man who had the ability to engage everyone. He could stand on the street all day and enjoy talking to anybody about anything. Dayoud remembers how his father, Ken, would stop and talk to the man selling hot dogs on the corner. His curiosity was provoked by anybody. He'd ask the guy how long he'd been selling hot dogs, who his supplier was, how much profit he made, and on, endlessly curious. But it was not only that Ken was eager to engage in conversation that amazed his son. It was also his ability to connect with all kinds of people, whatever their status or station. Ken was an electrical engineer by training, and he usually held the position of manager in whatever shop he worked. But he never used the power of his position to diminish others or to pull rank. Dayoud remembers visiting his dad at work and never having the sense that he was the boss. He had an easy relationship with all the men who worked for him. Dayoud loved his father's curiosity, his gregariousness, and the even-handed way he dealt with everybody around him. Even though Dayoud grew up feeling awkward and shy, so different from his father's ease and cool, he must have absorbed some of his father's social inheritance. In his early days meeting people and taking pictures in Harlem, a part of his father seemed to grow up in him. When Dayoud describes the curiosity and commitment that are part of his work and the depth and complexity that he strives for, he takes me on a flashback to a second grade teacher at PS 123, a public school filled with African American teachers and students in Queens. When he photographs his subjects and bathes them in light, he wants them to feel seen in the way that he felt seen in Mrs. Jones's classroom. Mrs. Jones, he recalls, was profound and extraordinary and very inspiring. In what way profound? I ask, somewhat surprised at a word that seems to go beyond most people's recall of the second grade. His response is immediate. She established real relationships with every single child in her class. Everything was possible, and everyone could do it. Ever since second grade, all of Dayoud's other teachers and all of his other educational experiences have been measured against Mrs. Jones's amazing skill and compassion, and they have all come up wanting. By the third grade, Dayoud's parents had enrolled their son in PS 131, a higher achieving white school where he was the only black child in his class, where he remembers feeling an uneasy, unnamed anxiety every time he stepped off the bus and into the school. Dayoud recalls an incident in fourth grade when one of the little girls got her lunch stolen, and he looked up to find the teacher singling him out. He saw her cold stare, her accusatory finger waving in his face, and he felt baffled and confused. I was innocent. I didn't even get the connection. Me, he stammered. Are you talking about me? Asked Dayoud in a sweat. Yes, she meant him, and he was to go down to the guidance office immediately. He was the culprit. She had no doubt in her mind. Dayoud rose up from his seat, walked the long march to the door amid the quiet stares of his classmates, and dutifully took himself to the guidance office, where, as he remembers it, the counselor gave him some weird tests, putting square pegs into round holes. In Dayoud's memory, this is one story among many. I'd get singled out, he recalls. Much of the time I was in a conflicted state. There were strange things going on, but what do you say? I couldn't name what was happening, and I couldn't find the words or the courage to ask. The following year, in fifth grade, he remembers that the class was writing a group play about colonial America, and the play was to be written in verse. Dayoud loved the assignment, and he leapt right into the middle of the work. The teacher was gratified by the way her class pulled off the assignment so quickly and with such apparent ease and mature collaboration. She inquired of everyone how they had been so incredibly productive. And the children all pointed to Dayoud, who smiled back shyly. I remember, says Dayoud with hurt in his eyes, how her expression changed in that moment. The raised eyebrow, the amazement, the surprise. She must have applauded his inspired work, and she must have thanked him for his contribution. But the only thing that Dayoud can remember is her utter bafflement and his inner confusion. The teacher wasn't able to reconcile his brightness with her stereotype of him. How could this black boy produce this verse? She seemed tormented by this. Dayoud's tales of being painfully misunderstood, the ways in which his fourth and fifth grade teachers were blinded by their prejudice, remind me of the opening passages of Ralph Ellison's classic novel, Invisible Man, a book published just before Dayoud was born. I am an invisible man. No, I am not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, nor am I one of your Hollywood movie ectoplasms. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you see sometimes in circus sideshows, it is as though I have been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorted glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me. End quote. The plight of Ellison's Invisible Man echoes through Dayoud's later childhood stories. He suffered what Ellison describes as, quote, the construction of their inner eyes, end quote. And he learned the hard way that to exist, we must be visible. The contrast between the biased oversight of his teachers at PS 131 and the full empathic attention bestowed by Mrs. Jones surely influenced Dayoud's approach to his art. His photographs, motivated by curiosity, shaped by a commitment to his subjects and their consent and participation, allow his subjects to express themselves, bathed in respectful attention. Our view of knowing, really seeing the people in our lives, in our relationships, our schools, our families, and our communities, might be informed by Dayoud Bey's masterful and compassionate lens. Threaded through his stories, we see the daily acts of justice, the warm embrace of inclusivity, and the relentless curiosity that says yes, yes, to little Sister Paula's haunting question, will anybody know who I am? Times have changed since Ellison spoke about the anguish and isolation of invisibility, and times have changed since Daoud Bey suffered the assumptive caricatures of his teachers who could not see his beauty or his braininess. And times have changed since my sister Paula climbed onto the school bus hoping to be seen, known, and cherished when she crossed the threshold of her classroom. But I would argue that the lessons drawn from their stories have even greater poignancy now, when the current educational discourse and policies are being driven by narrowing standards and creeping standardization that neglect the relational dimensions of teaching and learning. When our schools remain rigidly segregated by race, ethnicity, and class, when our long-standing aspirations for our schools as the institutions for individual and group mobility, as the engines of access, opportunity, and justice continue to be unrealized, Daoud's story and Paula's haunting plea feel both anachronistic and contemporary, both time-limited and timeless. So in closing, then let me offer 8 lessons that I believe are important for those of us who want to honor and enact our dual missions of excellence and equity, and welcome the exciting and difficult challenges of transforming and strengthening our schools. For those of us committed to embracing diverse voices and identities, and for those of us who want to build educational cultures based on relationships of respect. Here are 8 big last lessons. Are you with me?
Yes.
Terrific. First lesson is on symmetry. It's on symmetry. We need to reconstruct our images of and metaphors for respect. The old views of respect that emphasize hierarchy, approbation, and obedience based on habit, ritual, or law tend to lead to relationships that are static, asymmetric, and constraining. People become stuck in their roles of power or impotence, responsibility or irresponsibility, and are neither challenged nor inspired to try on other ways of being. Respect that is symmetric and dynamic, on the other hand, supports growth and change, encourages communication and authenticity, and allows generosity and empathy to flow in 2 directions. The image I hope you will have is one of a circle, not a triangle or pyramid. From this new perspective, differences in power, strength, and expertise may remain, but it is the respect that creates a relational, generative symmetry. The second lesson is on relationship. On relationship. Respect grows in relationship, and it is shaped by the context. I cannot possibly envision respect in the abstract. It is grounded in individual reciprocity and engagement, defined by the immediacy of the moment and the constraints of the setting. It is visceral, palpable, conveyed through nuance, gesture, tone of voice, figure of speech. One of the reasons that to dis has become a verb spoken by all of us, not just cool-talking adolescents, is because it seems to capture in one sharp syllable the potency of respect not given, the moment when we are suddenly made to feel diminished, dismissed, and demeaned. Those of us seeking to nourish respect, then, must see its embeddedness in growing relationships and appreciate the immediate and the visceral way that it is transmitted. The third lesson is on civility. Civility. It is important that we not confuse respect with civility. Although these notions are related, they are not the same thing. Civility refers to the rituals, routines, and habits of decorum that characterize a gracious encounter. We think of the etiquette of politeness and manners, an important but I believe, relatively surface engagement. Respect certainly includes attention to these rituals of civility, but it goes deeper. It penetrates below the polite surface and reflects a growing sense of connection, empathy, and trust. It requires seeing the other as genuinely worthy. The fourth lesson is on storytelling. Storytelling is at the center of respectful encounters, stories lubricated by genuine curiosity, authentic questions, and attentive listening. Stories also allow for rapport and identification across the boundaries of race, class, gender, prejudice, and fear. Through the unique and specific aspects of each other's stories, we discover the universals among us. Portraits, of course, also allow us to discover the universals in the particular. And remember, stories are not exclusive property. One story invites another story as people's words weave the tapestry of human connection. The fifth lesson is on language. If we are to make progress towards an authentic pluralism, a real diversity of voices in our schools and other organizations, then I think we have to listen carefully to the language we use and get rid of code labels like inner city, like at risk, disadvantaged, even urban, that are masks for words we refuse to say in the politically correct and subtly racist environments that we tend to inhabit. And we have to strike, or at least revive and reinvest in tired terms like multiculturalism and diversity that have lost their punch and challenge. One of the reasons that I love the word curiosity is because it is so plain, so core, so untarnished. It is the curiosity in Dayoud Bey's work that resists caricature and stereotype. If we really practice curiosity, we will be genuinely interested in understanding the colors and differences in our midst. We will be eager to get to know the stranger. And we are getting there at the sixth lesson of 8. On dissonance. Getting to know the stranger is not only motivated by curiosity, it also requires that we anticipate the inevitable moments of misunderstanding, misinterpretation, and missteps, that we prepare ourselves to navigate the moments of distrust and disappointment, that we choose carefully when to fight and when to engage the conflict that may open up the path towards reasoning and reconciliation. In other words, in building respectful relationships and healthy organizations, we must welcome the dissonance of voices and perspectives. In fact, we need to learn to love the dissonance, the noise, the spark, the discomfort, the challenge it causes. It cries out for notice, it demands attention, it pushes towards resolution. Whether it is the dissonance in Miles Davis's sketches of Spain, or the haunting harmonies in Alicia Keys, or the dissonance in Romare Bearden's collages, or the flash of rage or defiance in a Dayoud portrait. It allows us to see the conflict and resistance, to reflect on it, and if we are courageous enough, to take respectful action. And my penultimate lesson, the 7th lesson, is on family origins. The imprint of family is powerful in shaping the ways we each negotiate respectful relationships. As we try to create relationships that are nourishing and challenging, that have respect at their very center, we often confront the ghosts of our parents, the haunts of our early experiences as children. These echoes can be inspiring. We create relationships that have the imprint of our parents' empathy and generosity. This was the good fortune of Dayoud Bey, who inherited his father's irrepressible warmth and curiosity. But others of us must work to challenge harsh and troubling generational echoes. We have to try hard not to unleash on others the assaults our parents and caregivers wittingly or unwittingly inflicted upon us. Our determination to become teachers, mentors, and institutional healers may, in fact, be inspired by the deep residues of pain inflicted by abusive parents and caregivers. As adults engaged in respectful encounters with our students, we must do the opposite. Act out of compassion and empathy, restraint and connection, and in so doing, heal ourselves. And so after all of this talk and all of these words and all of this text, my final lesson is on silence. Respect is not just carried through talk. It is also conveyed through silence. I do not mean an empty, distracted silence. I mean a fully engaged silence that permits us to think, to feel, to breathe, and to take notice. A silence that gives the other person permission to let us know what he or she needs. In nourishing, respectful relationships, then, we must develop receptive antennae. We must take on the role of witness and learn to live in the stillness. At the still point, says T.S. Eliot in his famous poem, Four Quartets, there is the dance. At the still point, there is the dance. Birth and death join at such moments, inviting our deep curiosity and our full attention. For the dying, and I believe for the living, the immediate moment is the most significant. Now is the time. Now is always. Thank you very much.
There are some seats up here, so if anybody is standing or sitting in an uncomfortable seat, there's some soft ones up here. So I want to thank Sonia for this wonderful invitation. I really appreciate it. There is a problem, which is that every minute that I'm up here is a minute that Professor Lawrence Lightfoot could have had and been up here. And also every minute that I'm up here is a minute between the wine and the opportunities to talk to Professor Lawrence Lightfoot outside. So I apologize in advance for that. I think would be customary at this point for me to thank Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot for such a lovely lecture, and I could and I will do that. Thank you. But I need to stress at the outset that there's so much more that I need to thank you for. I've been a fan for many years, starting in the 1990s. And at that time, a friend and I were opening an alternative school in Washington, D.C. for kids who had been in the juvenile justice system. And I had been a public defender and was frustrated that the kids who needed the best that we had, the best teaching, the best counseling, the best curriculum, were getting instead the worst of those things. And in response, David Domenici and I started a small tutoring and job training program for kids who had been arrested. We cashed out David's 401k. It had $20,000 in it. We set up a nonprofit, and we bought a pizza shop on a tough corner, Florida and North Capitol. And the kids all wanted jobs. So we made this deal with them. Come in the afternoon for tutoring, and in return, they got the chance to earn money making pizzas in the evening. And we had some success, but we realized after about a year that to truly make a difference, we needed more time with the kids, and we needed a program that was more comprehensive. So we decided to turn our after-school program into a full-day school. Now, if this sounds rash, even foolhardy, it was. But we were young and passionate and determined to do something now. We made a lot of mistakes, but we were at least smart enough to read. And one of the books somebody gave me was this one, The Good High School, Portraits of Character and Culture by Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot. I was drawn to this book because, like this lecture, it was about goodness. In explaining why she wrote the book, Professor Lawrence Lightfoot says that even among educators, it seemed difficult, even awkward, to find the goodness and talk about the successes. She says she was frustrated by what she saw as the tendency to focus on what is wrong rather than search for what is right, to describe pathology rather than health. So she wrote about goodness in schools. And as one who wanted my school to be good, in all of the complicated dimensions of that term, I read the book. And I'm so glad that I did. I'll look more deeply into some of Professor Lawrence Lightfoot's most important themes shortly, but for now I want to highlight one sentence that I underlined at the time and that profoundly influenced my thinking when we set up our school. She describes an energetic African-American principal of a school in Atlanta, George Washington Carver High School, actually one of my crosstown rivals when I was in high school. I grew up in Atlanta and went to school nearby. She writes that his ideological stance with his all-black student body was the following: recognize the rigged race, but run as hard as you can to win. As I was thinking about starting a school for kids who are so often treated unfairly, that message spoke to me. Recognize the rigged race, but run as hard as you can to win. It captured so much of what I had learned growing up with the best black teachers and parents had taught children over the years. Yes, the world won't always be just. Yes, you will be judged. Yes, the police will too often harass and disrespect you. Yes, you may have to be twice as good or twice as respectful or twice as prepared. And we must work to change those conditions. Remember, the race shouldn't be rigged. But while it is, run as hard as you can to win. And that seemed right then, and it seems right now. So I want to begin by thanking you for this book, for setting me on my way in education. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge Chuck Lawrence, who Sarah quoted earlier. Chuck and some friends of his are here in the audience. He's my colleague at Georgetown Law School. And I remember after first meeting him, mentioning this book. And I said, I didn't know Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot was your sister. And he laughed, and he said, well, most folks don't think of it that way. He says, she's more well-known than I am, so most people think of me as Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot's brother. So let me pay tribute to the brother of Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, Chuck Lawrence, a teacher and mentor and friend for many years. This lecture is called Respect, Nourishing Goodness in Education, and it's rich, reflective, and nuanced. In this, it is everything that our public discussion about schools should be, but too often is not. Professor Lawrence Lightfoot knows this, of course, as I read her work going back to at least The Good School in 1983 and perhaps further yet. Much of her project is devoted to intervening in our public conversation about schools, families, and communities, pointing out what is missing, pushing us to think more broadly, more deeply, more compassionately. In my comments today, I'd like to think about Professor Lawrence Lightfoot's interventions, what they mean, and why we should stop and pay attention. I'll turn to respect and curiosity, the major subjects of today's lecture, in more detail in a moment. Before I do, I want to flag a couple of other themes lurking in the text of the lecture. First, Professor Lawrence Lightfoot rejects, and rightly so, the binary either-or nature of so much of today's conversation about schools. This has become really a bizarre fetish in education policy discussions. Too often arguments now devolve into a set of false choices. Either we have charter schools or we improve the public system. Either we need more money for our schools or we need to spend it more effectively. Either we focus on schools or we work to improve communities around schools, and so on and so on. Refreshingly, Sarah doesn't play that game. She knows we can and must do more than one thing at the same time. We need educational excellence and educational equality, high standards and individualized supports, rigorous curricula and trusting relationships. And in an era where it's tempting to search for magic bullets, she resists. She knows there are no simple solutions for complex problems. Good schools are hard to create and harder to sustain. And good instruction is both the most important and the most difficult part to get right. These are wise lessons. And if we took only this from Professor Lawrence Lightfoot, she would have done us quite a service. But there's more. In this lecture, she takes two ideas, respect and curiosity, that are familiar, but she offers a fresh way of thinking about them. Let me talk about respect first. Respect is not a new idea, of course, especially not when we think about education. But consider the prevailing vision of respect. Children respect adults. Students respect teachers. And respect is earned through the exercise of power. The prototype, admittedly an extreme version, is Joe Clark, the towering principal in the movie Lean on Me, who comes into a chronically failing school with 1 year to turn it around. And he walks the halls with his baseball bat, and he tells kids and teachers that he is the law. Now, we often think of this as commanding respect. A distinction between respect and authority is probably in order here. Authority is one thing, and it's a thing which schools need. Schools need to be able to draw on at times when working with students. But respect is something different. Think about Sarah's description when quoting her brother Chuck at their father's funeral. Their father, Chuck said, gained his allegiance by offering you his strength, not by threatening to overpower you. And Sarah builds on this idea, saying, respect often implies required expressions of esteem, approbation, or submission. By contrast, she says, I focus on the way respect creates symmetry, empathy, and connection in all kinds of relationships. Symmetry, empathy, and connection in all kinds of relationships. This sort of language does not typically appear in laws or regulations governing schools. These concepts are difficult, if not impossible, to legislate, and that's in part because they're difficult to quantify. In framing respect as she does, Professor Lawrence Lightfoot intervenes to expose the limits of our current accountability discussion. Consider what she says in The Good High School. She's talking about goodness and how complicated a term it is. She says there, goodness refers to the mixture of the parts that produce a whole. The whole includes people, structures, relationships, ideology, goals, intellectual substance, motivation, and will. It includes measurable indices such as attendance records, truancy rates, vandalism to property, percentages going to college. But it also encompasses less tangible, more elusive qualities that can only be discerned through close, vivid description, through subtle nuances, through detailed narratives that reveal the sustaining values of an institution. She says it is important to know, for example, how the attendance officer seduces truant adolescents back to school, his strategies of persuasion, cajoling, and rewarding, not just the attendance records. This is exactly right. How does the attendance officer seduce and cajole? What sort of relationships does she have with the student? Does she know the student's mother? Has she talked to the student about things other than the student's tardiness and other flaws? Does she listen to the student? This is the stuff of respectful relationships and of good schools, but it's hard to assign a numerical value to. And therefore, we too often, unfortunately, ignore it. There's another reason that Sarah's version of respect gets less attention than the Joe Clark model. It's harder to achieve consistently. This is especially so with kids that have experienced school failure. For them, for the kids we know at Maya, school is a place of vulnerability where their deficiencies are constantly on display. How do educators break down these walls that kids put up to hide their academic weaknesses? There are many answers, but a critical one is trust. The kids have to believe that this time the adults will be different. This time the adults in the school won't give up on them, won't just teach the kids who are getting it, and won't write them off as incorrigible. Now, developing respectful relationships, building trust like this in this way is not easy, right? By the time they're teens especially, adolescents who have had academic troubles and a deficit of trusting relationships have perfected a variety of strategies to hide their weaknesses and avoid being abandoned yet again. As an educator, just as you're beginning to think you've established a relationship, just as you've seen some real progress, just as that student has started coming to school every day or written a great essay, they will stop. They will quit. And they will do all of this as a way of testing whether you're going to give up on them now that the going has gotten a little tougher. Given how hard this is, including how emotionally hard, it's easy to see why many educators, even those who care desperately for kids, choose the Joe Clark route, grab a bat, and instill respect. Now, Professor Lawrence Lightfoot's other theme is curiosity, which I'll discuss for a few moments. Here, too, she intervenes to unsettle our common understandings. Today, when we discuss curiosity in education, we focus on children's curiosity and whether the education inspires or dampens it. This view of curiosity is important. It remains important in the current era. Too many schools are responding to testing pressures by stripping the curriculum to its barest essentials. And those of us who seek to resist this trend know that students deserve a curriculum that encourages them to be curious, to ask questions that challenge us adults, to pursue a thread of an idea, even or especially an idea which seems fanciful or weird to adults. But Sarah encourages us to look at curiosity from another perspective, that of the educator, that of the teacher. She argues that respectful educators must retain their own curiosity. As I read her, she suggests we don't know all that we think we do about the kids who sit in front of us. Students need what she calls fearless and empathic attention by adults. We must know our students and must know their stories. Her intervention is timely here as well. In the last decade, we've seen heightened attention to the achievement gap along race and class lines, as well as a flotilla of research that attempts to find causes and solutions for those gaps. The explanations by now are familiar to people in this room. Low-income children are exposed to fewer words as babies. Heightened exposure to lead paint, still too common in the homes of low-income families, retards brain development. Communities where poor children grow up often lack parks, rec centers, well-stocked libraries, and summer programs. The drumbeat goes on. And most of us in this room who have worked in the field have banged the drums ourselves at one time or another. We do it with the best of motives. We want to mobilize action on behalf of the most vulnerable. But of course, this has costs. As educators, it's too easy for us to become incurious. After all, we know who these kids are. They're the ones who got too few words, too little love. If we are incurious, we see only this. If we are incurious, we forget that while the young people we work with have problems, those problems don't wholly define them. This comes up especially for the kids we work with at Maya who are incarcerated. They are the most pathologized of all of our children. But we know that every young person who sits down in an English class where they study Macbeth, among other things, has tremendous assets. Even as they sit locked up, miles from their homes, they have hopes, dreams, and potential. They crave relationships with supportive, caring adults who believe in them and demand the best from them. They each have someone in their lives who wants them back home and who is praying right now that when they return, they will go back to school, they will get jobs, they will contribute to their families, and they may even go to college. Now, Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot knows this. She pushes all of us who work in schools to be curious. She pushes us to be like the counselor she interviewed some 30 years ago, 25 years ago at George Washington Carver High School. The counselor described her work this way: I try to learn about my students, the total student, the makeup, the attitudes, the way the student thinks, their ability, etc. I work closely with the homeroom teachers, the classroom teachers, especially with the registrar and the counselors. Along with the information I pick up there, I call the homes, I go into the neighborhood. This is my perspective, she says. And why is she doing all of this? Because the counselor says, I'm looking into the future. Looking into the future. Looking with the student. Helping the student to see a future, to perhaps see a greatness or a goodness that might be hidden. Let us all seek to be like this counselor. Let us all seek to be so respectful toward, so curious about the students we are blessed to teach. Thank you.
Well, we've just had two wonderful and very rich talks, and we now have some time for questions before we have time. So food for thought as well as food for the body. And please identify yourselves and wait for the mic. Liz, this lady up here. Right. Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah. Okay, we'll come to you.
Such an honor to be here. Thank you both very much. I have a 9-year-old daughter. She's a special needs child. And I fought very hard for her to have services in Fairfax County. The principal initially told me, because of my daughter's IQ scores, that there was nothing that could be done for her. She just couldn't, sit still long enough to focus. And I spent $10,000 of private testing and a lot of support to get her the services that she needs. And I just thought about all the children whose parents don't have the resources to do that, and what we can do as a collective community to really support our children. Now that she has the support she needs, she's bringing home A+, and she's just doing amazingly well. And so I just, I'm so inspired by both of you. And what is my question? What can I as a parent do to help others? And I just would really like to know how I can contribute to help other families that may be in the same place that I've been. Thank you.
You want to do that?
I think it depends on the level, how you want to get involved. I imagine that there must be support groups. There must be people who are where you were when you just got started, who haven't navigated the system, so are feeling all of the burden and the pain that you were feeling, but haven't. It sounds like you've had some success. It was hard, but you're now at the end of it. And I wonder if I would expect, I know DC better than Fairfax County, but I would think that there are educational advocates and other people in Fairfax County who are connected to parents who are where you were. And I would think that those parents would really benefit from being able to talk to you. So that's kind of at one level that I can imagine. And if you want afterwards, maybe during the reception, we could talk more back and forth and maybe figure out whether there's particular organizations for you to connect with in Fairfax or otherwise. But I just think that your your strength and your passion about this is something that the wider community needs to be able to tap into. So I'd delighted to talk to you about how we could do that.
Did you want to?
Well, one of the things that I'm thinking about is what a great question from a parent to try to talk about how you can use your own struggles, your own commitments, your own challenges, your own experiences to widen the net so that you can help other parents who are in your position. And I think one of the books that I wrote was a book called The Essential Conversation, What Parents and Teachers Can Learn from Each Other. And there are those parents out there who aren't only thinking about their own child and advocating for their one and only and putting him or her in a competitive position with vis-a-vis the other children, but are thinking of all children and the community of children. It takes a village to raise a child. And so I just think the impulse that you have here is wonderful. I also think that that there needs to be a way in which teachers are trained with a repertoire of pedagogies, ways of teaching and strategies for connecting and building relationships that can include a wider range of students, so that no one is left out. And I think that sort of notion of repertoire is important and not attended to in most teacher training institutions. The last thing I can say is this notion of goodness. That teachers who are good often ask their students and ask the students' parents. It's in the first conversation with parent, what is your child good at? Right? Some parents, so beaten down by the way school defines their child, will say, actually, he's not very good at anything. That's impossible.
Right.
It's impossible for someone not to be good at something. So that part of the work, I think, is really identifying, even for those children who are labeled in some ways as having disabilities of one kind or another, even for those, it's important to present that part of you which is good, which is strong, which is gifted, which is competent, which is excellent even. And that's true for all of us and all children.
I'm thinking about that scene in Precious where she first goes to school and she's so abject, and the teacher says to her, what are you good at? And she just sits there and she can't think of anything. And then finally, I think she says she knows how to cook. I think, isn't that what she says? Yeah. Have you seen it? It's fantastic.
I've not seen it.
It's fantastic. Yes, please. Please. Oh, Richard, can you help? Yeah. It's on. Just talk into it. It's
Okay.
voice activated. Please identify yourself.
All right. Since I'm retired, I tutor kids in a inner city school in Alexandria. And everything you've said is wonderful, but it goes absolutely against No Child Left Behind. I mean, when I listened to you, I thought, what world are you in and what world am I in? And the question I'm really asking is, what is the link between policy, or what you're working on, philosophy, and what's happening in No Child Left Behind? And now I hear that President Obama wants to put in a national standard. Will the national standard be different than No Child Left Behind, or will it just be more testing? Thank you.
Well, I think both of us sort of spoke to that dissonance or distance between what I have been trying to say most of my working life and what is now being realized through these various public debates, discourses, and policies. Because I tried to say it in my talk today, that is the move towards narrower standards and really interpreted it as standardization means that everything I just said in response to the last question is not a part of that. I still think it's tremendously, first of all, most teachers are feeling incredibly frustrated, incredibly inhibited and constrained by these policies and by teaching to the tests and all of the kind of quantitative, narrow, static dimensions that are represented by that. And so it's not only my voice and others like Professor Foreman's, and there are teachers' voices that are out there too, I think, railing against this approach. I think we're all in the same world, but we are very, very different in our orientation. And I think that one of the things that James said is that this is hard to legislate. The kind of thing I'm talking about, and the qualities that are embodied in something like respect or curiosity, it's hard to do. For all kinds of reasons that he so articulated, or so beautifully articulated before. This doesn't mean that we should stop saying it. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't find every platform to speak about this. And with groups of teachers who are teaching, in educated communities, with parents, because it seems to me that if we don't lift up our voices, if we don't continue to say these things and to stress these things, and to even try to amplify the voices of teachers who are feeling these things, and some parents as well, then we've lost the fight completely.
The only thing I would say is, so I agree with everything that was said. I would just add that it seems to me that some of what Sarah was talking about, that I was building off of, is still needs to be thought about even in a No Child Left Behind world, right? So part of it is, yes, we need to change that, and I actually do think that I'm actually reasonably optimistic about what the Obama administration is doing in terms of education policy as compared to what we had, but we also can't use that as an excuse for not doing some of the hard work that she's asking us to do. So within constraints that exist, some of the challenges I think that she's offering are things that there's I guess what I'm saying is there's room to operate, and so it's almost like the rigged race thing flipped over again. There's two messages here. One is we need to make the race not rigged, so we need to open up constraints and open up the conversation. But then the other thing is within the space that we have, because we do have space, the question is, how do we behave and perform in that space? How are we talking to each other? How are we training our teachers to operate in that space? So that's the only thing I would add.
Back there.
Maureen Dowling from the U.S. Department of Education. Thank you so much for your wise words and your truthful words. And I was wondering if you could speak to the two issues of language and then public conversation. As we talk about education, a phrase that has been used again and again is preparing our students for global competitiveness. And I'd like to have you speak to that in a world where, as you said, we're one kind of global community, and your thoughts about that as related to building respect within our own little families and school communities and the larger world.
Well, I think I would change at least one word in that sentence: preparing our students for global citizenship. That is, to be participating in a community that's global, that's bigger than themselves, to be engaged in that. But that doesn't necessarily mean competitiveness. I mean, one of the things that I think is part of the language of public policies and education in this country for a long time, it is about educating to compete, right? Educating, and this is sort of a notion of this individual trajectory. It is never about this group mobility. It's never about justice. It is very much a line that has to do with being better than the other guy. And being better than the other guy is rarely based on individual initiative or achievement or motivation or will, but so much, I mean, it's been seen across the time to be about class and race and gender and all those kinds of things. So it seems to me that in that sentence, I like global, I like preparing, and I just don't particularly like the end word, which is competitiveness. And I would say citizenship, to participate in a discerning and generous way in life of the world. Yeah.
Don.
I'm Don Wolfensberger with the Wilson Center. Thank you both for wonderful talks. I really enjoyed that. I'm wondering whether self-respect is prerequisite to respecting others when we're talking about children, or by symmetry, do you mean it's mutually reinforcing? And then following up on that in connection with what you just said, how does your conception of respect as being central to education compare with the self-esteem movement that was incorporated into the curriculum in California? I noticed you said compete is kind of a bad word, and I think that was played down in that curriculum. I'm not all that familiar with it, but it was subject to even some ridicule from what I heard, but I'm just not that familiar with what that movement was all about and whether it's still in the curriculum.
I can't answer the second question. I don't know enough about that curriculum either, and as someone who loves sports, I want to just kind of quickly say that I don't think compete is a bad word. I think that there's a lot that we learn from learning how to compete fairly, and even there's a lot to be learned from learning how to lose, right? And pick yourself up and carry on. And so I was really responding to this sentence which bothered me. I think that this business about self-respect is ongoing throughout our lives. You know, this is not a finished process. It isn't, perhaps I said you need this in order to respect others. You need to feel good about yourselves. But I think the process of feeling good about yourself is never done. It's not finished. It's not accomplished. We continue to sort of face that challenge in deep, dark corners of our being under new circumstances, in various relationships and places for the rest of our lives. So that I think of it as ongoing. I was sitting here listening to James Foreman talk about my work, and I was saying, I don't think I've had a better time in a long, long time of someone being so deeply respectful in terms of what it was I was trying to do and say. You know, it was just so enhancing. And I thought to myself, this is going to make me feel different tomorrow about myself. You know, and it's not that I question myself and I'm not feeling good about myself. It's just that there are these moments that are really important moments for all of us, and they continue for the rest of our lives, it seems to me. So it's not done. It is just continuous, it seems to me.
Down here. Yep.
I'm Marjorie Lightman, and I'm here today as a guest of the Toby Foundation, actually. Tad Toby is someone I've worked with over many years. I would like to say that one of the things I liked hearing from both of you was a spirit not only of respect, but of generosity. One of the most notable characteristics of public debate recently over the years in Washington is the absence of generosity. So I would hope that as you go on speaking at every platform you can find, you add generosity to respect.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Right here.
Good evening. I'm Michelle Coghill Chapman. I'm a doctoral student at American University in educational anthropology. And last week I had the most wonderful experience of interviewing a parent who works at a public charter school where her children attend. And in that interview, I asked the parent, you know, why did you choose this school? What was it about the school that made you want to enroll your children here? And I realized, thinking back on that interview and hearing your presentation, Dr. Lawrence, that she experienced at that school in the interactions with the teachers and the interview that she had with the administrators at the school, she experienced various levels or dimensions of respect as you laid before us. And I just wanted to offer the comment that so many of the families, the parents that our children come from, the children that we educate, their parents have not experienced respect in this way, in their homes of origin or in their communities or on their jobs or in their own apartments or houses, and how important it is for us to continue to talk about this and to share this and extend it, not just to the children that we interact with, that we have the honor of teaching and working with, but also to their parents, because they are, many of them are in need of it as well.
Thank you. Flip, did you have? Yeah.
Thank you. Philippa Strum from the Wilson Center. Thank you both so much. Many, many years ago, before I went into university teaching, I got a master's degree in education from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And during that year, I learned a lot about how to write a lesson plan and things of that kind. I was put into a 5th grade classroom in Belmont, Massachusetts for a semester, and that was probably the hardest experience I have ever had in my life. But because all of that teaching about how do you write a lesson plan didn't really cut it when I had to interact with 35 kids who were sitting there waiting for me to do something that would grab them. Now, I want to ask you, given all of these wonderful things that you've laid out, can you just in a couple of paragraphs indicate how do we go about teaching our teachers so that these ideas are incorporated into their thinking and in the way they prepare for classes?
Well, I don't know when you attended the Harvard Graduate School of Education, but I'm happy to tell you that we no longer teach teachers about how to write a lesson plan, although that may be important. That doesn't happen. I think that one of the things that I would say is, I mean, this goes back to the curiosity piece, is that teachers have to continue to be learners, right? And that students are watching teachers to see whether they are in fact curious about the world around them. Part of being a good teacher, it seems to me, is being able, in that vein, is being able to ask questions, good questions, questions that allow for a kind of a process thinking, that allow for kids to bring themselves to the subject, allow for them to bring their experience, their own stories to the subject as well, allow for them to reveal their knowledge rather than to always be confronted by what they don't know, those kinds of things. So I think that first is being able to ask a very good question. I think another is being able, perhaps most important, to listen, to hear what people are saying, and to see your role as teacher as one of listening to student voices. Again, these are very sort of broad meta points, but they are important, as it seems to me, as you think about your word, grabbing the students, questioning, learning, listening. I think another is a way of kind of recognizing that you're teaching to not just cognitive sort of dimensions of a person, but to the whole person. And that requires the developing kinds of relationships that allow them not only to know that you know them, but you are willing to be known by them. There's nothing that's more, I think, amazing to students is to feel that they know who their teacher is, and they know what their teacher cares about, and they know what their teacher's passions are. And that kind of direct relationship is, I think, very important. Add some more things.
No. Well, I'm not touching what they should do at Harvard Graduate School of Education.
No, but I mean just what teachers should have.
Talk about some of the teachers at the charter schools. I mean, I know you have some Teach for America people there and things like that. I mean, what do those schools do to get those teachers to prepare them?
Well, to grab the
to grab the kids, but also how do they prepare the teachers? Or what do you say to the teachers?
I mean, I think it's all of these things and more. I mean, some of it is more less. I mean, we are intentionally speaking at at a fairly high level of abstraction because that's what's appropriate for the setting that we're in. But there are also just much more kind of mundane things about how to operate in a classroom and how to deal with. For example, just to get very mundane, obviously at a school like ours, and I think in general at schools, making sure that kids are all feeling respected in the classroom, respecting each other, respecting the teacher, and that involves certain norms of behavior that are important, and having strategies that you use as a school We use a concept called, there's a fairly popular thing now, positive behavior intervention, and it's more or less, what it more or less boils down to is paying attention to a lot of little small things and giving kids lots of constant rewards and immediate feedback for things that they're doing right. And I mean, it's amazing. I had my law students from Georgetown out teaching in the school out in the juvenile prison, and one of them had been in Teach for America, and she had used this system with stickers and wows and giving kids this immediate positive feedback, and at the end of the class tallying up and giving them these tickets, which then at the end of the week would lead to prizes and all of this stuff. And she had used this at her middle school to great success, and then she was afraid to use it. She thought, oh, these kids are going to think that it's too corny. They loved it. They ate it up. They were so sort of, they so want to know that you're paying attention to those small things that you're doing. You're noticing them. You're recognizing them. So again, we can't sort of get down into the weeds here too easily, but it's a lot that you need to do. But I do think the stuff that Sarah's talking about is the stuff that often gets forgotten. There's almost more attention paid to some of the stuff that I'm talking about, which is important, and we need to do it all.
Okay, there, and then we'll have the ones in the back.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to certainly indicate that I was just thrilled by the presentations from both speakers. My name is Lois Harrison Jones. I'm currently a professor at Howard University, but also a former P-12 teacher and administrator. And so I'd like to make an observation and secondly ask a question, if I might. My observation is basically that we know that we tend to teach as we have been taught. And having been on the receiving end of teachers from teacher preparation universities and principals, and now working there, I do see the disconnect between perhaps how we role model what we expect teachers to be able to do when they exit. And so I guess my question really is, have either of you had much success in fast pacing that transformation of pedagogy displayed by those of us who work in teacher preparation programs?
Well, one of the things that it's interesting, I teach a course, a couple of my students are here, they know this about me. I teach a course called The Sociology of Learning and the Sociology of Education, which is a huge, broad course about the entire ecology of education, all the places where children grow up and learn, and the connections among all those places, families, communities, and schools. One of the things that this course forces students, many of them are going to become future teachers, to do is to think about their place in that, in all of those environments, and to reflect autobiographically on their own learning, their own trajectory of learning, and their own educational story. And the readings in that course, and hopefully the lectures in that course, make people take it very personally. So it is not only about studying the educational environment, but a sort of a self-study about their own learning and where their practices of teaching, their assumptions and presumptions about teaching, the values that they take into their teaching, come from, and what are the levers for change of those. How to be very deeply self-reflective, self-interrogating, self-critical about those things which we assume as working, but no longer work. So I think there's really a lot of work that needs to happen in teacher training, which is really about interrogating your own learning autobiography, if you will, and really trying to think critically about those things which are challenges for you in dealing effectively with and being supportive of the students that you're teaching. Those things which get in the way, and those things which inhibit the kind of connections and relationships that we've been talking about today.
Let me just gather a couple of more questions, and then, because yeah.
I'm Leslie Fenwick, Dean of the Howard University School of Education, and want to extend my colleague's question or remark. Dr. Lightfoot, your work has deeply influenced me for quite some time and is actually the centerpiece of the School of Education's conceptual framework for our new teacher education program. Howard, for at least 15 years, has not had an undergraduate teacher preparation program. And using your work, particularly Respect and the Good High School, along with some of Nell Nodding's work, we've used those pieces as the conceptual pillars for a new undergraduate teacher preparation program entitled Teaching as a Healing Art. And we're really looking at the 12 colleges and schools that comprise Howard Universities as sites for training of pre-service teachers. And we've linked an audit of the children in the Howard University community to those sites of expertise throughout the university. So I'm saying all that to say that your work has actually been incorporated into the structure, the creation of a new teacher education program, and we hope to admit the first cohort of students into that program in 2011, fall 2011. So thank you.
Oh, so thank you. That's great. Thank you.
I think there was one more question down here. Richard, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, and then down here.
Hi, I'm Marilyn Snyderman, parent of 3 DC Public School graduates, and also a friend of Chuck. I just had one question following up on the teacher training. Have you had, what's the best way in current schools where you have all these teachers who've gone into teaching with a culture of respect and a passion for the work and sometimes get beaten down by the system? Have you seen good strategies or campaigns to turn that around, to really intervene in schools so that the teachers have those discussions about changing the culture back to where they want it to be around respect?
Look, could you just wait one second? Let's just take this last question here, and then we'll finish up. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Kimberly Mealy with the American Political Science Association here in Washington, D.C. And I'd just like to thank both of you for sharing your wonderful thoughts and experiences with the group. And my question is very similar to the previous one. How would you encourage individuals, either teachers or professors or students, who come in contact with situations in which there is no respect, and you know, they would like to share that with others? How would you encourage them to react or to be proactive in those situations? What should they do?
We saved the
I
best
don't know
for
if
last.
it's the hour or I'm tired or it's just, these are just very hard questions. I think one of the, in response to Chuck's friend's question, sir, I would say that all of this is made easier by a collection of teachers working together. There is not, doing any of this stuff alone is nearly impossible. And 1 plus 1 is much more than 2, and 2 plus 2 is much more than 4. Groups of teachers working together to try to create a professional community of learning, a mutually respectful community of learning, a commitment to students and their learning that then begins to, in an organic way, spread through and ripple through pretty powerfully. I've seen it happen, an entire faculty, or almost. That's one thing I've seen, and I think that's even better than the second thing I've seen, which is very, very fine educational leaders, principals who are committed to a set of not just academic standards and rigor, which is very, very important, but a kind of building a culture explicitly and transparently around these themes of respect and curiosity, and even that word, the L word, love. I mean, I've heard principals sort of talking about that, and you know, principals modeling that for their teachers, and then teachers modeling that for their students. And as James said, in the classroom, beginning by, in each classroom, insisting upon a level of I used the word before, civility, which is different, but you got to begin somewhere. Decorum and civility and rules of behavior that begin to establish patterns that then can deepen into something like respect. In response to your question, I think that you don't get respect without asking for it. And I think, we all know that respect is hardest closest to home. My kids call me the queen of respect because I wrote this book, and they're always putting me down when, when I fall off the wagon, and which I do a lot because that's the hardest place to sustain it at home. And there's some way in which we will not allow ourselves as individuals or as collections of people to be abused for sure, that we have to ask for and even demand respect. I have just stories and stories of 37 years of service at a place called Harvard University, where I have in faculty meetings less and less with each year because I'm getting older and older and wiser and, more outspoken, but had to sort of stop meetings and insist upon respect. Just stop it. Look at me. Listen to me. Did anyone hear what I said? And this doesn't have to be done in a rancorous way. This doesn't have to be done in a whining way. We don't have to name it as racism or sexism or anything. Just pay attention. I paid attention to you. You pay attention to me. And it's uncomfortable. It's James's word earlier, unsettling, right? It's sometimes countercultural because you're not supposed to bring up from below those things which most people do not name or pay attention to. But that's the only way to begin to protect yourself and to begin the discourse.
Thank you so much. I think we've all learned a great deal, not only about learning and teaching in schools, but obviously in our entire lives. This has really been a truly wonderful conversation. So thank you very much, both of you, for being here.